Thank you for downloading this podcast from the Forum for Philosophy. Subscribe for weekly discussions of science, culture, politics, and the arts from a philosophical perspective. The Forum is a non-profit organisation, and our events are free and open to all. You can support our work via our website and Facebook page.
Welcome. My name's Danielle Sands and I'm a fellow at the Forum, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's event in which we'll be thinking about the capacities of plants. Can they think? Can they solve problems? Are they sentient? And we'll be thinking about their relationship with us as well. So let me introduce our speakers. So Paco Calvo is the director of the Minimal Intelligence Lab at the University of Murcia.
Publicity.
Karine Bonneval is an artist. And Tom Greaves is Senior Lecturer in Philosophy at UEA. So Paco, perhaps you could kick things off for us. Why should we care about plants?
Well, that's a good question. When I wake up every day, I think that stuff myself, right? I say, why plants, right? Especially in a philosophy department, right? I'm in a philosophy department and run a plant lab. So it's kind of awkward, no? And probably, if you are here, you might be all thinking about plants in different ways, or you might care about plants for different reasons, right? And they might all be equally valid. Some people care about plants for aesthetic appreciation. They like them, they enjoy them, or we think of them sometimes as resources, right? And as that's, in environmental studies, that's just the way sometimes people go, and then you say, hey, you want to step back because it's not a resource. You want to care for plants in a different way, right? So not as something that you can use for your own benefit, for your purposes, but at least in my case, I want to understand them for their own sake. So to see what's going on there, right? So to treat plants not as objects that you can do things with them, but to treat them as subjects or as agents. So this means to treat them as agents with their own needs, their own problems, their own ways of getting around, their own solutions to those very idiosyncratic problems, right? So that's a way to put it, that we want to understand plants in themselves. But then it cannot just be that, right? Because if it was just to try to understand plants, I would be doing plant biology, right? So it's something else. And what really worries me that I don't think we really get what intelligence means. So what's intelligence about? I'm not talking about plant intelligence, but intelligence, right? So when we think about our own mind, right, our own intelligence, the problem that we have many times is that we take so many things for granted. Like, okay, intelligence is about this, is about that, because we are so far too used to thinking in our own terms. We speak in loud voice, we have our narrative, we fool ourselves about what intelligence is about. And education has a lot to do with that, because we are brought up into an educational system that gives us the answers rather than trying to make us think different questions, right? So then there comes to this point when you say, hey, I never thought what intelligence was about, but I was told to be intelligent is to do this, to do that, to follow rules, to behave like a computer, right? Sort of like this. My thoughts are this software running on my neural hardware, things like that. And then why plants can throw some light upon intelligence itself, I think it has to do precisely because they are so different from us. So the closer they are to us, the easier is to remain being fooled. So, or because we think of higher level cognition, so it's easier for us to empathize with fellow humans or primates or mammals. They all have neocortex. And then we think, well, sure, it has to do with that. Then when you question that very starting point, you say, hey, let's think of other organisms that are just the other way around, as far away as possible from us. So the more dissimilar. And then let's see what they are able to do. And if they are able to do smart things, if they are smart guys, they come around with solutions to their very, very important problems, they wouldn't be here otherwise. But they are here passing down their genes. So they've got to be doing something right. And it happens to be the case in the case of plants that they don't have neurons, they don't have a nervous system, they don't move around, they are sessile. Then you might think, hey, we might be getting better clues by studying them than by studying higher level cognition in fellow humans, right? So one reason to care for plants is that not just to understand themselves, but to understand more about ourselves by looking at them, right? To see what is all that unite us all, right? Despite, accidental makeup, like our morphology, our anatomy, the way we are, designed, So from their point of view, things look rather different, right? Another way to put it is like sometimes you say, well, look, it's not their fault that you have to go to Tesco once the talk is over, right? You go to Tesco, get some food, go home. It's not their fault that you need to do that. So people think, well, plants, they can't afford to be stupid, right? They can't afford to be stupid because they are sessile, being rooted, they can afford to be stupid. But we are the guys moving around. We cannot afford to be stupid. I put it the other way around. Say, look, how smart they've got to be passing their genes despite being rooted, right? It's not their fault that we have to go to Tesco, right?
So my own experience, similar to yours in a certain sense, so I'm coming from the side of environmental philosophy, and the work that I did for quite a long time was trying to think about that in terms of the different ways that different creatures make sense of the world around them, but a lot of that work was focused on humans in comparison to animals, other animals, right. And plants still tended to recede into the background as the things that were being made sense of rather than the things that were making sense of the world around them. So I'm really interested in this idea that you're trying to think about some kind of subjectivity or openness to the world around them that plants are capable of achieving. Right. But I just wanted to ask you a little bit about this idea of minimal intelligence. Right. Because I've got a few worries about that, really.
So do I.
So when you were talking, so you're in a lab for minimal intelligence, and you were talking about higher level cognition. And my main worry about that way of talking is that it seems to fit into quite a traditional way of hierarchizing life.
Absolutely.
Right? Of thinking about plants as having certain kinds of capacities for nutrition, animals building on that with perceptual capacities, and then human beings having kind of logical, rational capacities. That kind of very traditional scale of nature. I think we've got an image. Right, so we have this scale of nature here, beginning with simple being, then life, then sentience and intelligence, and that kind of illustrated on the left-hand side by a rock, a plant, a horse, and then some thinking people. So it seems that what you're doing is much more sophisticated than that, but it seems to also incorporate a certain kind of thinking about the way that plants interact with the world around them, if we're going to talk in terms of minimal intelligence and then higher level cognition.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I couldn't agree more about how unfortunate the label is, right? A couple of years ago, when I was on sabbatical in Edinburgh and working on the book project, on the plant intelligence book, and Andy Clark was asking that right question, like, why minimal intelligence lab? That's the wrong label. And I couldn't agree more. And that's a good way to put it, because it shows how much education can do in the wrong way. So how deeply rooted all these misconceptions are in ourselves, that even when you try to think differently, you use the wrong terminology, which is what I'm doing. So it's very difficult to think out of the box, to think differently. To genuinely think differently, you have to be questioning what you are doing yourself on a daily basis, because we have all these inertias and we follow all these traditions, and we have to step back and say, hey, what is it that I'm doing myself? Despite the program being completely heterodox, you might be relying on these labels.
So perhaps that illustrates precisely some of the limitations of our own intelligence. Right?
Absolutely.
That we get into those tracks through our capacity for learning and culture and so forth, and traditions that create mental habits.
Yeah.
And that other kinds of intelligences might not have those capacities, that limits them in some ways, but they don't have those limitations that we have. They have a more, you might say, open responsiveness to what comes along.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there is another issue, which is like, you cannot, we are at the same time questioning what we mean by our own intelligence, and in a different way. So it's not just the minimal, the lower bar, but the higher bar. So we usually, when we deal with these issues, we always go far too quickly to the higher capacities, right? Forget about the terminology, you see what I mean, the higher, and forget about that, right? So it's in the positive sense, right? So our sophisticated behavior, right? And then we call it like the scaling up issue. Like I say, well, we can deal with these things in such a way, ecologically, environmentally speaking, but then when it comes to the real thing, the stuff we do when I book, a flight ahead of time, like I'm planning my holidays next year, and a year in advance I'm thinking of flights or cheap tickets, whatever, accommodation. So all this planning ahead of time is something that requires so much inner machinery going on that you just cannot understand how other systems could be able to do it, right? But then we have to remember that this summit, the peak, we have to think that each organism, they all have their own summit. So we have and so they are not somewhere in between walking on the hill trying to get to your summit. They have their own summit. So the capacity itself is already there. So for example, in this case, the capacity to anticipation, right? Prediction. So successful behavior is not only behavior that is adaptive, it's also behavior that is flexible enough, that is anticipatory, that is goal-directed. So all that stuff is already there. Actually, it's there in bacteria, in any form of life, because any form of life whatsoever needs to deal with contingencies ahead of time. So it's got to be proactive and not reactive. That's the idea, right? So once you apply those levels to each summit, then they are not laden anymore with human cognition, right? So you can talk about plant predictions or plant anticipatory behavior, and it's not like a minimal version of our really sophisticated way of getting a ticket a year in advance of holidaying, right? So we just keep in mind those two things, right? It's about different summits for different ends and in different ways, right?
So we can retain the same vocabulary as long as we think about it in different ways, or as long as we kind of actually reflect upon our use of that vocabulary?
Well, yeah, I think it's perfectly safe to use it. Actually, there is a lot of pedagogy to be done, not in the way we apply it to plants, but in the way we apply it to ourselves. So we need to rethink what we mean by human thought itself, right? So I couldn't agree more in that sense. So we just need to rethink what it means, again, going back to the digital metaphor, the digital computer metaphor, no? Now, it's like sometimes you think about, for example, this is a good example, like thought is like a game of chess, right? Because it has to, and then if you think of thought as a game of chess, you go to this abstract level where you are just following these abstract rules. In fact, you are following it in such a way that you could play a game of chess anywhere at all, because it's a formal game. The rules that you follow, you could follow them. Actually, you don't even need the board to play a chess game. You can play it in your head, right? But you couldn't do that with a game of pool. You couldn't play a game of pool the way you play a game of chess, because every single game of pool is different, because details of physical interaction matter, are essential to understanding how the cue ball is behaving, the other balls. So you couldn't reproduce the game twice, the same way that you could play a game of chess, the same game of chess forever. And that's telling us not about how, if we are safe in using this terminology for plants, but revisiting the way we use it for ourselves. So no, human cognition and cognition in general is not following abstract rules in the same way that we follow them when we play a game of chess. Is following the type of interaction we enter in when we are coupling to our surroundings. So we are, this idea of cognition being embodied and embedded, situated, that's what matters. And there is where we are all in the same boat. Plants, animals, all forms of life, in the tree of life, that's what unites us all. The fact that we need to deal with contingencies, and we cannot do that unless we are actually coupling to the environment. You cannot sit back and cook up the solution to the problem. You've got to cook it up while moving around, while behaving, right?
So when we want to think about plants, is the best way to start from our similarities with plants, do you think, Karine?
For me, of course, as an artist, I just have interpretation of what I learn. I'm working with scientists since years, but the first experience as a human being was very close from what you were saying before. I just stepped into the rainforest for the first time with no codes, no way of understanding it, and I have really this perception of being inside an alive being with the whole, like, being in interaction with all kind of different system of life. I had not a clue about what was going on with me. It was a scary experience, actually. But then I realized when I go back, I say, okay, that's life. That's not this one. That's why I put this image in first. I say, has nothing to do with that. We are inside something and we are dealing with these alive beings, but we don't quite understand them really because we have no sense in common. But the thing we have in common is the breathing. The first scientists I'm working with are ecophysiologists, and they are studying how the exchanges of oxygen and CO2 of trees. And it's a very simple thing we have in common because it's very hard to figure out how they do live plants because we have no sense in common, and the vocabulary sometimes it's hard to put on same behavior, but we breathe together. So it's something very simple I share with the people. Is a movie I did about that with thermic cameras showing the breathing of trees. So of course the image is not precise, but this was a flexible bell put on the bark of a tree to concentrate 24 hours of CO2 exhaled by a bark of tree. And then when you press it here on the right, you have like a face, you can see a human face, but this very tiny cloud that is going out is the breathing, it's the kind of breathing of a tree. Because a tree is breathing 24 hours a day from the roots to the leaves. It's breathing constantly. It's not expiring air like us. It's like a different kind of breathing. But in fact, we are breathing together. And I think to make a summary of what we should how we should act today is to think first about that. We are breathing together. Very simple.
I think what that gives us is a nice illustration of the different kinds of intelligence that we've been talking about. So when you ask, how should we approach understanding plants, should we think in terms of general capacities that we share with them that make us similar to them, or what makes us different? That operates in terms of our own understanding with those general concepts, comparing and contrasting, to another kind of intelligence that you're describing that we share with plants to one degree or another, which comes through this kind of lived exchange, a certain kind of intimacy, you might say, that we create with other living beings through the various ways in which we interact with them. So that's a different kind of understanding, I suppose. When it comes to that more cognitive understanding of thinking of should we begin with what we share or what is different, it seems to me that obviously people are going to have different opinions about what the best kind of approach is, but it's always going to be a kind of dialectic between those two. I don't think we can develop any kind of understanding if plants turn out to be completely alien to us, right? So Paco was emphasizing earlier how different they are, and I think that's obviously really important for this discussion. But if plants turn out to be completely alien to us, then we really have no kind of cognitive grip at all. So it's always going to be that interplay, reminding ourselves of the possibilities for thinking about similarities and analogies, but never kind of like getting so carried away that we produce false analogies and have false assumptions about identity.
In fact, I like to say that we are very much plant blind, right? So it's an illness. We are sick. We are plant blind, and we can cure it, right? So one way to put it in terms of how this coupling takes place, or how we we might be able to start appreciating their life is to slow down, right? Yeah. So unless we slow down, we don't see them because we are in our, locomotive, hectic lifestyle, moving around, and then you get to see the stuff that moves with you, right? And we forget that we need to keep in mind the time scale of the phenomenon you want to observe, and not the time scale of the observer. So it's not the phenomenon's fault that you are stressed up and hectically moving up and down because you need to catch the train to get to the theater or whatever. They do life differently. So it's you, the one that has to slow down and chill out and relax and say, okay, if I want to understand what their life is about, if I want to open this channel of communication, it's me, the one that has to slow down. And that's something, for example, that today, nowadays, we do it with time-lapse photography, right? So we take like a time-lapse photography, like one picture every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes. I do it every minute, and and even within 1 minute, you won't see 2 consecutive frames where you don't see a pixel changing. So there is movement below the 1 minute threshold. So they move much more than we think. That's another way to put it. But you walk in the garden and you don't appreciate it, right? So
do we have some images to?
Well, yeah, we have.
There is.
Well, yeah, we have a great one.
Tomato.
Yeah. So just watch. Forget about this lateral. So first, because I'm standing, you cannot see me. But this is the one that matters, right? So just watch how it's revolving around, right? So it's. So you see now it's moving. It's doing like 360 degrees, right? So it's revolving round the clock. But now pay attention what's going to happen soon. Now it keeps going round the clock. This is a climber, of course. It matters to it to find the support to twine around, right? So it's still doing the full revolution, the full circle of revolution. But now, I think in a couple of loops, now you got the idea.
It's almost grabbing it.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating. I want to step in and help it out.
Yeah. Now you see what happens. It hasn't touched it yet, so it's perceiving it at a distance. You see from this view that it haven't touched it yet. But now look what happens now. Right now, goes to the back and fishes all the way. You see? Did you see that? So it's cutting across the second, skipping the second half of the circle, say, I'm going for it. Right? So look at that. It's really amazing. So it was, at the beginning, it was doing the whole thing, because put it this way. If it was just a mere adaptation, if that behavior was just a mere adaptation, you might say, well, it's not such a big deal. I mean, of course, climbers care about the support to climb up and do photosynthesis. They need that. They need something to climb on top of, right? But you might say, well, they are simply circling around, and those, because the environment is usually full of things, those that happen to bump onto something, well, those are the ones that passed their genes. But this is different, because this is not the lucky ones who eventually bumped onto something. This is actively or proactively searching for the support, for the target. So it's goal-directed behavior. That's the idea. It's really going for it. But we wouldn't appreciate it. We are surrounded by vines everywhere. Now, if you walk out in London, you'll see climbers all over the place in the gardens. You don't see this. You think they are there, sessile, still doing their little thing. That's what they are doing. But this thing that you saw, that's 3.5 days. 1 picture every minute. So it's taking 1 picture every minute and assembling it in footage, like 24 frames per second. So that means that 1 second of the footage that you watched, 1 second takes 24 minutes. So that's what happened in 24 minutes, every second. So that means that it's us who have to make the effort, the extra effort to put ourselves in their shoes and slow down our observation to their time scale, right? But there is a risk in doing it this way, which is that, especially for younger generations, because, like nowadays everybody pulls out their cell phone and does all these videos and whatever. So it's really easy just to go out there, do the settings and let it record it, and then, well, I'll come back on Monday and see what the plant did, right? But we are missing something, which is that if I take a picture every minute, I'm missing 59 seconds every minute. So I'm assembling 24 seconds in 24 minutes in 1 second, and I'm missing 59 seconds every minute. So you are missing 99% of the data. And still, we have the impression that what we see is real time, but this is an illusion. See what I mean? So even watching time lapse is something we have to do with a pinch of salt. So Darwin, that's amazing, because Darwin himself was doing these observations to the naked eye. So Darwin was lying in bed, and actually once he was like really sick, he was for 3 months in bed, and he was, would you care to put a pot on the bedside table? And he was in bed like watching the plant. But he would do it to the naked eye. Yeah. What I mean to say is that with some effort and training and rehearsal, we all are able to do it. So it's not something that pops up when you have technology. You need to have the eye, the mind, the frame of mind. And Darwin had the frame of mind, and he didn't have a cell phone, right? So it's more important our way of thinking than the technology that we have. That's important because nowadays it's very easy to say we do it with all these gadgets, but we would risk missing the point at stake just by doing all this fancy stuff. It's about how we approach the problem. And Darwin was approaching it this way. Darwin was saying, look, botany doesn't subordinate to zoology. Botany and zoology are on the same level. Plants are not subordinate to animals. They have their problems. And that's a damn problem for a plant, for a climber. Where the hell can I get hold of something to go up there, right?
So it's really nice what you're saying about slowing down in order to get into the tempo of the plants themselves, and that works two ways as well, quite nicely. So it's about the attitude that you bring, that you try to find yourself in the tempo and the temporality of the plants themselves. But we also know from everyday life that just being surrounded by plants and getting into contact with plants does tend to slow us down and give us breathing space. And so it's not just the attitude that you bring, but that kind of interaction helps you to kind of cultivate a slower pace as well. I mean, just anecdotally, being a bit of a yokel, just arrived from Norwich, I arrive in central London and it's totally freaking me out, getting really stressed out, and managed to, because I'm coming to a plant forum, focus on the trees as I walk down the road, and it's calming me down a little bit. I find a little park behind this building, and really managed to slow down and kind of calm down a little bit. And that's because of that kind of interaction that I have with plants. So it's both a question of kind of the attitude that you bring, but also that they help you to do that.
I often do the comparison to people when I try to explain what you say. It's about imagine yourself being a fly. And because as human, you are watching a fly, you think it's doing erratic movement and she knows perfectly what she has to do. And I guess in the eyes of a fly, it's about what are these slow human beings? They are just not moving at all because she's so fast. And it's about different kind of times being like in different level of existence.
Right. So, but why do we take movement to be so important?
I don't know.
Something that
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's something that really worries me because I think that intelligence is about moving around. I think it's about moving around. And so put it this way: if plants wouldn't move, I would accept that they are not intelligent. So why? But they happen to move around. We just need to understand that. So plant behavior, when you think, what's plant behavior about? Plant behavior is phenotypic plasticity. So it's growth, it's development, it's how their phenotype changes plastically as a function of whatever is impinging upon their sensory periphery, right? That's what's making them adapt one way or another. I elongate more if I need more light. If the conditions are too dark, I elongate more. If I spread all over the place. So they just adjust, right? Phenotypically speaking. So that's that's their movement, right? But that's, so what really matters is not that you can locomote from point A to point B, that you can move from here to here, right? It's the fact that by moving around, you generate information. So you provide the solution, the answer to the problem by moving around, and that's important. So that's the opposite to this game of chess idea of cooking up the solution in your mind. So it's not, I'm not bringing the solution from my cognitive resources, I'm not crunching it up, no? No, it's, I solve the problem by negotiating the environment, by coupling with it, right? So it's like a dance. As you are coupling with the environment, things happen to flow. When they flow like this, then it just emerges, the solution itself, right? So it's in the very growth itself, despite not being locomotion. So as animals, I think we might be putting too much stress on locomotion itself. And growth, we have to understand that it's plants' form of locomotion, right? They don't move. Well, actually, this is interesting because some of the problems that we have nowadays in engineering, for example, think of robotics or AI, so artificial intelligence designs. Japanese robotics are all humanoids or inspired, or dogs, or they are inspired in animals. So you have this little pet and then you do the robot like the pet, right? Or when we talk about biorobotics, so inspiring our robotic designs with life, we always have an animal model in mind. So you think, for example, okay, I need to do this little robot to, to walk up on the vertical surfaces, to clean the glass of the high rise, whatever. And then you think how a lizard does it or how an animal goes it, and then they explode the same sort of thing, like nanotechnology, like, okay, they do it with these little things on their legs, and then we try to mimic that with our technology, nanotechnology, so you play with that nanoscale, right? But what we don't get is that if we were inspiring our models with plants and not with animals, so if we were exploiting growth and not locomotion, we would be getting different ways around. So for example, you remember like a couple of months ago, there was like this big breaking news, like the Opportunity, the rover on Mars that NASA had sent, right? Remember that? A few years ago, they sent these rovers, couple of rovers, and the second one just passed away like a couple of months ago. This really long-lasting dust storm and covered all the solar panels and then just couldn't make it anymore. But all the problems they had were engineering problems. So they were worrying always about hey, watch out, that sand dune, don't get the wheels stuck into the sand dune. Or watch out for the crack, don't get stuck in the crack. Or watch out for the crater, just you have to go over the edge. And all the skills and the engineering problems had to do with displacement. So how do you get from point A to point B successfully? Because after all, the rover is a geologist. It wants to sample the soil and see the constitution, the minerals, everything. So they have to be taking samples to move around. To move around, why? Because we have the zoocentric idea that this got to be inspired by an animal. So if you're a plant, or if you inspire your robotics with plants, you could be thinking of growth and not locomotion. So you could be thinking not of going from point A to point B, but of growing from point A to point B. So put it this way, you reach B without leaving A. You see what I mean? Then you get rid of all these problems of don't get your wheels stuck into the crack. You get rid of all those problems. So you see, we are not solving with better engineering those problems, but we are simply getting rid of them by using plants as our inspiration to model robotics. So that's a way to show that it's not the movement itself, but is whichever form of phenotypic plasticity delivers the goods. In the case of plants, that's the one that delivers the goods. So
Stefano Mancuso is working with some engineer to make plantoids.
Yeah, plantoids. Yeah.
To how to make plastic grow inside the
right.
soil.
Yeah.
To go inside, and so they can make analysis from that root system. And I was in a lab where they are more on soil ecology, and some specialists of the internet were studying of fungi, so all the mushroom like inside the soil are growing, because they do have problem when the head electricity or net system is cut, all the rest is dead. It cannot work. But a fungi doesn't work like that. If you cut the head, it still works at the end. And people still don't understand how to do that with a net. And they are studying fungi to see, because they are doing better than us.
Sure.
That's it.
Well, it's a matter of being distributed. So the distributed cognition, it pays off because nothing is essential. But that's just the result of being rooted. So if you are rooted, you cannot afford having something which is an essential living organ. So I have a heart, 2 lungs, and things like that, and that they are pretty helpful to me. But I can run away if a predator comes. So I can save this thing. But if you are stuck in the soil and you cannot flee, then the strategy is simply to distribute everything throughout the whole plant body. So if you chop one branch off, I grow another one. So you will never chop my heart or my lungs because they are distributed all over the place.
I wondered, though, in some of the things that you were saying a bit earlier and then just now, whether there's still a little bit of zoocentrism, animal centrism in what you're saying. So I really like this idea that we're focusing on growth as the primary response to the world that we get from plants, and that if we're going to talk about intelligence or consciousness, then it's going to be a kind of intelligence or consciousness that it involves, as you said earlier, goal-directed activity that comes from growth. But I wonder if even goal-directed activity, if we're going to use that as a kind of preliminary definition of intelligence, whether in focusing on the way that plants do that, we miss some of the things that are different about them, some of the things that are distinctive about them, which is to say we go out to look for when they're proactive, when they are doing something like goal-directed activity. Whereas we might focus instead on thinking, well, what's wrong with reaction, with responsiveness, with being open to what's going on, with what just comes to you, because that's something that's obviously the case for plants. Because they don't have locomotion, they just need to take what comes to them, in one sense, right? So there is goal-directed activity, there's intelligence, but there's also a great deal of, I can't get out of here, so if it rains, it rains, if it suns, it suns, and I need to, if you like, be open to what comes.
Yeah, I see what you mean. But I wouldn't agree here on that, right? The thing is that the more we know about the way plants deal with all these problems, the more amazed we are. So it's not like okay, they don't take life as it comes just because they can't flee. It's just that the responses are so sophisticated. For example, we are familiar with these examples of the emission of VOX, of volatile organic compounds, right? They emit airborne chemicals to attract, for example, if a plant is being eaten by a caterpillar, it will emit these chemicals that attract the wasp that eats the caterpillar. So it will attract the bodyguard, right? And the bodyguard will deal with the caterpillar. But some other plants, you know what they do? They turn the caterpillars into cannibals so that they eat each other. So they mess with their brains so that they change their behavior. And the caterpillar starts munching on the leaf and eats the other caterpillar. You kill 2 birds with 1 stone, because the one that is eaten, that's not the problem anymore, and the other one is full. Right? So you are safe. So that's a way of saying that I take the point about because I listen to myself and I keep falling on these zoocentric terminological traps and things like that. But I don't take it seriously because it's just like a way of speaking, right? But when you get to the root of the problem, what the risk is that we might be missing behavior which is more sophisticated than it looks like. And in this case, for example, the idea of what's wrong with being reactive. So what's wrong with being reactive? There is nothing wrong with being reactive in itself. But what's problematic about it sometimes is that you might not have enough time to try again if you miss it the first time. So because, if I miss catching the glass, I can have a second go. So I miss, and okay, no problem, I try again. But if you grow irreversibly, if I grow this way and this branch is going that way and I miss the target, there is no way I can try again. And the pattern of growth is so slow that, put it this way, you'd better not miss it. So in that case, it's even more important to behave proactively, right? So take, for example, the growth of young plants under dense canopy, right? When they are growing under dense canopy and they need to find a patch of light and make their way to the roof, right, to the top. So you couldn't say, hey, if I'm gonna grow, because of course the sun is moving and the flex change, so it's not like this is the source of light and I go there. It's changing constantly, right? So which is the best way to go where they have less competition? So less green guys going for light and more potential source for me, right? So they rely on very complex measurements, which is like, for example, the ratio of red to far red light. Because red light is being absorbed by leaves. No? You see them green because that's the green part of the spectrum is the one that bounces back, right? And they absorb the blue and the red. And the far red goes through and hits the earth, the soil, right? So the ratio, the proportion of red to far red light is providing really valuable information to the plant, because it's telling the plant how many guys are around, how dense the vicinity is. So they will grow to a place where the ratio goes up or down, depending whether they want to find more or less neighbors, right? So that means that they need to keep growing, and whilst growing, they need to keep sampling and comparing. Hey, so this is like the game the kids play now, cold or hot. You say that in English? Colder, hotter, right? So you could say like, okay, I move this way, the ratio goes down. I move this way, the ratio goes up. So okay. So this circumnutating, like this one is revolving around, and then you don't see that circular shape anymore. You see that the shape is changing because it's making its way. It's a sophisticated way of making its way towards the target. So that's it. The way to put it is that it wouldn't be wise to put all your bets on the reactive side, because that's only when the environment helps. When the environment is giving me the solution, oh yeah, I will trust you. But if it's you who has to do things to see what the solution is going to be, the best solution that you have, then you might need to behave proactively and do the sampling and see. So that's where growth provides you information. No, by growing, you have information, in this case, in the form of those ratios, right? So that would be the way to put it. But I see your point.
And what do you think about the fact that plants that are used for foods are using us to just be, wheat, and there is a lot of theories about that they are using us to be a lot, to cover a large scale of lands for like wheat, corn, or whatever.
There's a total disruption of our expectations of who's the agent.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Well, in that case, there are two issues. Think of a pattern of coevolution, no, between a plant and a pollinator. We always put the emphasis on the pollinator, right? We always say, okay, the pollinator, the bee, the honeybee, whatever, is the one doing is the real business, and the flower is just there waiting to get the pollen spread around. Yeah. And in fact, it's a little bit the other way around, right? So many times, it's the plant that is the one pulling the strings of the puppet. Mm-hmm. So the honeybee is the puppet, and the plant is pulling the strings, right? Yeah. They do it sometimes by increasing or reducing the amount of some chemicals in the nectar, in the extrafloral nectar, to make some insects become addicted and cover the whole plant or go away, depending on their needs, right? So, for example, if you want a herbivore to go away, you want yourself to be covered with ants, and the herbivore won't like to eat that plant. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they do that by increasing those chemicals that are going to mess around with the information processing system
Yeah.
of the. So who is the guy at the wheel?
Yeah.
The guy at the wheel many times in these patterns of coevolution is the plant, not the pollinator.
Yeah, it's really interesting in terms of the parallel with the kind of changing narrative in animal studies about the history of domestication, right?
Yeah, yeah. So she was talking about in the case of humans and crops, there is a twist there, because I think that domesticated plants are much more stupid than
Yeah, exactly.
than wild ones, right?
I have this story told me that a woman shaman, is not using cultivated plants because she said they are too stupid. It's like a zoo, animals in the zoo. You cannot observe them as wild animals because
No, it's true.
they were raised in captivity. And plants in pots or plants in fields cannot react as wild plants.
Yeah.
So she said, no, I cannot use them. They are not. They are silly.
Yeah, we've been shaping their genome for 10,000 plus years. So I mean, can you imagine a wild climber really, having trouble to find the support, as opposed to a domesticated climber that you have the guy always putting the pole for you plant it and put the pole. Hopes. It doesn't need to search for anything. It's always there
So
because.
I'm making my plants stupid, am I?
Yeah,
I'm doing that.
yeah. That's a way to do it. Okay, so quiz question, like in the pubs, right? So what's the most intelligent species? I would say, well, not a species, but it's not a category, but I would say weeds. Weeds have got to be the smarter because it's the opposite to domestication. It's the ones that we pluck and pluck and pluck. We want to get rid of them. So we are their worst predators. It's just the opposite to agriculture. So just think about it. You have a crop with wheat, whatever, and then you see the weeds and pull them. And then imagine all the pressure that they have to pass their genes. And they are doing so successfully because of that pressure. They have to evolve all these adaptations. And the more you pull them, the more they grow. Weeds, you don't get rid of them. And if you have this beautiful rose and you are not careful enough, it will, really go, wilt, right? Weeds don't wilt. They thrive. The less you care for them, the less water, the more problems they thrive. Because that's the type of pressure, evolutionarily speaking, that was there from day one, that they wanted to be plucked and plucked. So those are the smartest weeds.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the kind of practical things we can learn from plants. What about the philosophical lessons we might be able to learn from plants, Tom?
I think we have been discussing philosophical questions already, thinking about the intelligence, about how we understand other living creatures. And so I think one of the things that philosophy can do is to help us to think about the different ways that we get to know plants and we get to understand plants. So that's something that we've been discussing a little bit already. But I think it's really interesting to have such a diverse panel here, because I know a lot of Paco's work revolves around botany and plant neurobiology, and then we have a very different kind of approach, although drawing on some similar things and working similarly with botanists and scientists that your kind of artistic work does. And I think one of the things that philosophy does is to think about the different kinds of understanding that we get from different practices. And it seems to me that we also ask skeptical questions. And one of the things that I did in preparation for this panel was to read a couple of Paco's papers. You've described some of the things that you work on already in our discussion, thinking about whether it would be reasonable to describe plants as sentient or conscious or intelligent. And I wonder really whether scientific research is ultimately going to be able to answer those questions for us. Seems to me that insofar as it can, there's also going to be a good deal of philosophical thinking going on in the midst of the scientific research, right? So we discover all these incredible things about plant neurobiology, about their goal-directed growth and goal-directed behavior that you've been describing. But when we come back to our kind of lived experience of sharing the world with plants, there is this kind of skeptical note, I think, that might kind of like come in. Am I really comfortable in describing plants as feeling pain or being conscious of the world around them? And those kinds of questions are how to connect the observations and data of scientific research to what we actually understand in our lived experience and the way that we share the world with plants, I think is one of the important questions that I think philosophy would ask here. So it seems to me that, you know, when I've thought about this question, I end up thinking there's some kind of structural ambiguity or uncertainty about what we want to say about plants in terms of their subjectivity. So we began by saying, you know, we're interested in plants not just as objects, but as creatures that can make sense of the world around them, that have a certain kind of subjectivity. But then when we think about that, when we are sharing the world with plants in our everyday lived experience, there's, I think, always this kind of skeptical note that comes up. You know, am I really comfortable describing plants as having an interior life, as having consciousness, as even having sentience? And it seems to me that that our lived experience tells us that remains an open question in our relationship to plants, that we're happy to entertain that idea, and it's really important that we entertain that idea in the ways that we develop practices with involving plants, the way that we communicate with them, the way that we connect with them and try to understand them, but that we rarely, if ever, get to the stage where we're happy to say, yes, I'm absolutely certain that there is another consciousness here. So I would contrast this to the way that we experience the world with other human beings or with a certain set of other animals. So it seems to me that on the whole, our experience with other human beings is that it's absolutely taken for granted that, apart from some philosophical, skeptical exercises, the way that we actually experience the world that we share with other people is absolutely taken for granted, that we share consciousness with them, that we share the world with them, and that in principle we can understand how they understand. You know, obviously there are lots of intricate complications in our reactions to other human beings and our lives with other human beings where, yeah, we don't end up understanding them in quite the way that we should, but in principle it's open to us to come to understand them because it's taken for granted that we share consciousness with them. With a set of animals, I think, very often, it's the case that we can take for granted that there is consciousness, that there's something like sentience for almost a very large set of animals, if not all of them. But the ambiguity starts to come in there at the level of, okay, so there's consciousness there, I'm pretty confident of that, but I'm never quite sure if I know exactly what it's like for this animal. So I know it's like something. The skepticism in our experience doesn't come in at the level of I'm not sure if there is consciousness here. I know there is, but I'm never quite sure that I'm on the same page as my dog. I'm going to be quite close to my dog because of that history of coevolution. But then with other animals, that note of skepticism, I know that there's some consciousness here, I can take that for granted, but I'm never quite sure just what it's like for this creature. And when it comes to plants, I think that level of skepticism goes a bit deeper. So the question is always, well, it may be that there's consciousness here, that there's sentience here, but it remains an open question. I think that's what our lived experience tells us. And when we learn about scientific results of the kind that you've been describing, it seems to me that can act as a spur for us to kind of reflect, change our practices, often change our lived experience, but our lived experience at least my lived experience so far, has always ended up with that kind of what I call structural ambiguity or uncertainty, an open question about whether there is actually something that it's like for this creature.
Yeah, what is it like to be a teenager? I mean, when I get home, I see my daughter and my son, and I say, I understand plants much better, right? I'm on the same page with plants, and I'm not kidding. But put it this way, no, I see what you mean. But there is something interesting here, which is that this set of species that we are on the same page with has not remained constant throughout the years. So it keeps increasing. So at the beginning, it was just fellow humans, then primates, then all mammals. They all have neocortex, and we like that. Now, just only a few years ago, octopuses, squid, all the cephalopods became members of the club. So the membership, what gives you access to the club? And if we are increasing the number of members that can join the club, we should ask why is that so? So what made us change our mind with respect to octopuses, for example?
See, I'm a bit sceptical about that history. It seems to me that there's a certain level of kind of intellectual history where we had a club like the kind of hierarchy that we showed on the slide earlier, where the clubs involved different kind of capacities, and we kind of lumped in some creatures or others on the basis of pronouncing that they have some capacities or others as an intellectual exercise. But as a question of lived experience, it seems to me that every swimmer in the ocean, every fisherman who's ever come across an octopus has had some sense that there's a consciousness there.
Yeah, but you know why? Because they move around, and it's easier to empathize. So even, this is funny because you have some psychologists that defend the idea that there is sentience where there is life, right? So it's a biogenic approach rather than a computational approach. So it's not how sophisticated the type of information processing that you can accomplish, but it has to do with life itself. Where there is life, there is mind, they would say, right? And they talk about sentience in bacteria. But there is something interesting here, because for bacteria, they say they are sentient, but you know why? Because they see bacteria swimming up a chemical gradient, a sugar gradient, for example. So if you see the bacteria, oh, look, the bacteria is going, so you can, it's easier for you to, oh, look, it's going to grab it, okay, it's going for the target, things like this. And then the argument goes, because these people deny the ascription of sentience to plants, which are eukaryotes. I mean, this is just a bloody bacteria. And there is no problem with bacteria because they move around. So they say, when you move to plants, they say, no, but here there is no sentience. And because in the tree of life, this is further up, then you would say, well, why would they need it? So they got rid of it because it's metabolically is far too expensive to retain something that you don't use. So it's like plants didn't need this thing that bacteria do need because they swim around, and then they got rid of it. And that's funny because bacteria are not octopuses, are not fish swimming in the sea. They are obviously much less sophisticated than the multicellular eukaryote. But so it's not about that biological sophistication or information processing sophistication. It's about that empathy has to do with locomotion. The guys that move around, it's easier for us to empathize with them. And if they are stuck, we treat them far more differently.
I've done a lot of work on cockroaches recently. It's certainly not the case with cockroaches.
But I think it's a question about where you are from, because Philippe Descola is very well describing when he arrives at the Ashwell in the South America rainforest. They do share the world with other beings, whatever. So they do have songs for for plants. They are singing with plants. They are just like accepting that the world, they are part of the world full of alive beings, and we have to share. So they can sing because plants cannot sing, but they are addressing, and they are not the only ones. I found a lot of collection of traditional songs that are addressed to plants. They are not there to, to work like, for agriculture, to go for a best rhythm or something like that. They are just here to share the world with plants. They're really addressed to them. And I think it's really Occidental, in fact, to think this way.
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
in a lot of culture, it's not a problem at all. In
Absolutely.
Asia, you cannot destroy a wall because a wall is the place for a lot of alive beings. You have to first remove a lot of mosses, whatever, little plants, little insects before, because it's bad otherwise. And I think we just lose our common sense, in fact. We have to relearn. But we knew that before.
I completely agree.
Yeah. But now we need, of course, scientists to prove that it's alive, and they do have science.
That's why it has to do with education. It's a cultural issue. So we need a lot of pedagogy.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah. Karine, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the role of your work here and the
okay.
conversation between art and science.
Okay. My actual work is about movement because, so as you told, it's easy to talk. I try to put clues because I have to deal with a lot of different kind of people that are going to art centers, and sometimes I'm kind of a translator to what you say very, very easily, in fact, but sometimes it's pretty hard to communicate this to people. And I say, okay, plants are moving, so I'm using time-lapse images to see, for instance, this plant is not going up because of the light, but because plants are feeling the gravity as well. They have cells that are feeling the gravity and they can move from the gravity. And that's one of the things that is called, the whole pack is called proprioception. And in fact, in dance, in contemporary dance, it's one of the tools you use to move not from your muscles, because you can move with your muscles, but now you can have a thinner approach in contemporary dance using proprioception, meaning you are using the way you are acting with the word and the way you are inside your body, try to move inside the air. So I think it's very close to the plants, and so we are trying to move like a plant, which is pretty hard actually, because they are really much better than that. So that's the first images. So you can just, so it was about the rainforest. It's a picture I did in French Guiana. For me, it was really the first experience with this alive being. So this is, it's more about plant blindness. It's something I did really about on the topic about exoticism, because all these plants are tropical plants you can find now in supermarkets. But in the 19th century, it was very collectible plants you put in very expensive greenhouses. And now you cannot, they are objects, they are plants you can find in waiting rooms and very cheap plants. So what I did is a very silly thing, it's called philoplasty, so philo for leaf and plasty like plastic surgery, and it's about putting artificial ads on plants and they adapt. I mean, I really point that these plants are, they can live with that ads like fake hair, you can go like gold leaves or things like that. They can live with that because they are adapting themselves, and it's a way for me to put to avoid the plant blindness in like human language. Look at me, I'm just here, I'm alive, and I can adapt. Because sometimes, of course, people are really shocked about what I'm doing to plants. They say, "Oh, you are hurting the plants," but they don't care. I mean, they just adapt themselves to what I'm doing to them. So that's about the breathing of the tree. So I used the word chamber is used. So this is what I was inspired in science. So in ecophysiology, they are measuring the CO2 exhaling from the bark of the tree with these boxes that are called chamber. So I use this one to, so those are big chambers to see the CO2 efflux inside the tree from the top of the leaves to the roots. So this is really scientific measures. And this is the camera I use to see the breathing of the tree. And so I built a big chamber around the trunk, a bark of a tree. And so we use the camera to go inside and to breathe with the tree. So these are images, so because it's a specific thermic camera with a cool lens, and it makes the CO2 visible. So here's the human breath. So you can see, of course, we can exhale every time very quickly a lot of CO2. But as I showed you before, this is 24 hours of CO2 concentrated in one little chamber. That was showable, but it's very tiny, of course, compared to us.
So that was a time-lapse thing?
I think it's because there were two shows and it's not the good one. So that's... I'm doing different things about... So this is something is to share the same space. So I do that in workshop. Is about putting your hand in a petri dish. Is about the microorganism we all have and we all share, in fact. And a scientific I'm working with, Matthias Friedrich in Berlin, is calling that community coalescence, because we are full of microorganisms highly adapted to our biotopes, and of course all alive beings are full of microorganisms that we need to have on us to live. In fact, they are really helping us to live. And in that, you have a same space shared by microorganism of human hands and bark of trees. So first you put your hands in a petri dish, then you scratch a bark, and then they are living together in a structured geodesic dome that is the same shape of the one I used for the movie, and so you can go inside. And this is umarmen, meaning embrace. So it's like how you can share some intimacy. So you were talking about taking the time, and it's how in the city taking the time to share intimacy with a tree. So you can go and no one, of course, everyone is seeing you, but you look like a half tree, half human being, which I like this fact too. And this is another piece I done. It's called "Listen to the Soil," because the scientists I was working with say, when I say to people I'm studying soil, they say, "Wow, it's dirt and it's dead." And I said, "No, it's full of life, of course." So it's full of life. So if it's full of life, it could make sounds. So with a bioacoustician, I've recorded the sound of different samples of soil. Of course, my compost is very noisy, but I do live in the countryside, and the field behind the corner that is full of chemistry is kind of dead soil, so it's making no noise at all. It's very silent. So it's ceramic pieces done in big installation. And so this one is about, again, the movement of plants, and that's it. It's a kind of messy thing. Sorry.
I wonder whether now might be a good time to take some questions.
I'm interested in what you were saying earlier about weeds being smart, and about the question, we don't know whether the plants are exploiting us or we're exploiting them. It struck me first that didn't have anything to do with intelligence, because the problem that plants, along with the rest of us, are solving is how to stay alive and how to reproduce. And I don't see that needs intelligence. But the question of who's exploiting who, I think, is a very anthropomorphic stance. We're used to rivalry in human life, but I think our artist member of the panel would say that actually we're all part of a network and we depend and live together. We're not competing in the way that your question implied. That's a comment, really, not a question. But.
Well, think of banana. Banana, they don't have seeds. The banana we buy in the shop, they are seedless.
They will repropagate with vegetative food, don't they? But wild bananas don't do it that way.
Yeah, sure. And they're much smaller and ugly, and we don't like those. We have to spit out the seeds. So that's why we grow the other ones, right? The fleshy, seedless ones. So whether that's not exploitation or not, it's a matter of taste. But imagine a banana itself saying, well, seeds? Why would I need seeds for? I don't need them. These guys propagate me. Just a comment.
But I think there is an interesting issue that you're touching on there, which is thinking about intelligence in the context of evolution, in the context of struggle for survival and coevolution and cooperation, and whether that frame might impose certain kinds of limits on how we think about the behaviour of organisms that we share the world with. So we ended up talking about intelligence in terms of problem solving, and that connects to what you were saying about we're all trying to solve the same problem, which is how to stay alive. But there's all sorts of things that we do which aren't directly connected to that problem as human beings. And those other things that we do are a large part of what we tend to describe as our intelligence, right? And so I suppose that's partly what I was trying to get at earlier when I was thinking about, well, let's think about plants as kind of being open and responsive to the world around them. You know, they try to solve those problems. They try to solve problems of survival and adaptation and so forth in the evolutionary biology context. But is that context going to be limiting in our appreciation?
Yeah, no, that's right, because maybe we've put too much emphasis on those examples. But in fact, the examples that I'm more interested in understanding are the ones that have to do with ontogeny, not with phylogeny. So with the life of the individual itself and the experience it has accumulated, and so learning, for example, right? So plant learning is a beautiful field, and it's not about survival. It's about, so we know, you know, the Pavlov's dog. You know, the example of condition learning. Now we know that you have the plants that can learn, can perform condition learning, so can associate two different stimuli and, you know, respond selectively in terms of that association. So it's like the bell and the steak, the food is the same. The very same thing is taking place in plants, which means that it's not something coded in the genes. It had to do with the experience of the individual itself. So it's learning, and learning that has to do with the life of that guy and not whatever was inherited.
You wouldn't call that adaptation?
Oh, no.
They do have memory. I mean, it's known till the 19th century with the sensitive plants that they can recognize what is like something that is, you know, this plant that is like closing its leaf. And it was an experience. This biologist just put this in a carriage because he says, okay, can this plant recognize if it's like permanent, so it's not a danger, or is it an animal that is going to bite me, so it's a danger, so I have to close my leaves. And after a while, the plant learned that it was not a danger, but a common movement. It has to adapt itself to that, so it reopened. And this can stay like this plant is learning from the experience and then adapt itself to that. I mean, it's like a very simple experience with no very like fancy tools, done in it was Lamarck, I think, in the 19th century.
But the case of habituation, I mean, habituation is the most primitive form of learning. And I would agree in the case of habituation that you can put it in the basket of adaptations, right? But in the case of associative learning, the added thing that you have on top of habituation, that's why it's less primitive form of learning, is the fact that you are pairing the conditioned and the unconditioned stimuli. And those two, I mean, one cue is neutral. It has nothing, it's meaningless to the survival strategies of the plant, right? The bell doesn't tell anything to the dog unless it's paired to the food. So that's why it has to do with, so it's a more sophisticated form of learning. But in the case of memory, that's why I was, at the beginning, we were talking about what we can learn about ourselves and not just about the plants. We have the idea that our memory has to do with storing information in our mind. So we store information that we can retrieve at will when we need it. And that's what I'm questioning. Human memory is not about having things stored in some compartment. So that's the cartoon version, of course, inherited from cognitive psychology, that we can have, learning memory has to do with that. And no, we are neither following rules, we are not retrieving information that is stored somewhere, we are doing nothing of that. We are simply resonating to the environment. We are coupling to the environment in real time. And if you resonate to the environment, you are able to retrieve information, but retrieve is the wrong word. It's not retrieving the information, it's resonating such that the coupling is not maladaptive, right? But you wouldn't need to be looking for something somewhere in your brain. Where is that piece of information sitting? Information is not sitting anywhere. So that's the analogy. No?
I'm aware we've only got 5 minutes left. I would like to squeeze in some more questions. Yeah.
Hello. I was really interested when you started talking about kind of empathy with plants, and just wanted to talk a bit about that and about sort of the kind of ethical implications, perhaps, of what you've been talking about. So, do you think that all of this understanding plants as sort of closer to us than we might think might have any implications for what we have to do towards them, and kind of what do you think it would take for it to be perhaps wrong to kind of kill plants or something in the way that it's wrong to kill animals, in the sense of plants being kind of part of that club. So do you think that there ever could be those kind of rights on the parts of plants, and what do you think would kind of create that kind of situation?
Thank you. And there's another question behind you.
Thank you. I'm interested in the idea of speed and adaptation and movement, given that we're, as humans, we're becoming more and more aware of the possible existential ramifications of climate change. Do you have any ideas about how it's going to change plant behaviour?
Thank you. And one last question, before you take those.
I'm just wondering if you acknowledge a distinction between consciousness and cognition, if you see that distinction as problematic or not, because I wonder in the course of the discussion if those things may have been confused at times. And also briefly, you seem to be making a contrast at times, or suggest a contrast between the kind of proactive behavior that you've described and adaptation. Just wondering if I mistook you in that way or not. I mean, I could see that proactive behavior of that climber plant, for example, as an adaptive behavior. So,
thank you. Lots to go on there.
Should I quickly try and do the ethics?
Do ethics, yeah.
So that's a super interesting question. A lot of animal ethicists are very, very skeptical about this kind of conversation. I have a colleague who pretty much refuses to take part in this conversation because of the potential implications, from his point of view, of taking the focus away from those central ethical questions of human relationships and human-animal relationships. It strikes me that if we got to a point where we were more and more happy talking about plant sentience, the capacity to feel pain, and here again I would go back to my remarks about kind of lived experience, that it seems to me that in our lived experience and our ethical experience, we very rarely, if ever, get to the point where we're happy to say, yes, this plant is in pain, but we also very rarely want to completely take that possibility off the table. So there is that ambiguity, and I think that pushes over into ethics, that we have a certain kind of ethical ambiguity which isn't easy to overcome, even if we want to overcome it. But I would say that if we did get to a point where we're happy talking about plants feeling pleasure or pain, of having sentience like that, then clearly that would open up a lot of ethical questions. But ironically, I think one thing that it might lead us to consider is whether our ethics really should then be based quite as much on those considerations as a lot of animal ethicists still think, right? So if sentience was completely ubiquitous in the living world, pleasure and pain were just completely ubiquitous, and whatever we did vis-a-vis plants and animals and our relationships obviously to other human beings involved creating pain, being unable to get rid of pain, and clearly we couldn't really live in any kind of tenable way without killing plants constantly. I think where we would get then is to a position where we would have to rethink ethics in terms of whether the whole thing is based on sentience, pleasure and pain.
Maybe those two questions. Maybe can we start with the last one and then
Go for it.
So the last one on the distinction in between cognition and consciousness. I have always tried to keep them apart. I used to keep them apart. Say, well, let's discuss, computational or representational theory of the mind. What is it about the mind? And then we can talk about consciousness as a separate issue. And the more I think about it, the less clear I think that we can tell them apart. We can keep them apart. Because in the end, I think that the key has to do with the notion of integration. So if behavior is flexible enough and is intelligent, that has to do with not responding to cues on a one-to-one basis. So it's not that, okay, light, phototropic behavior, gravity vector, geotropic behavior. So it's not one-to-one hardwired responses. You are being invaded by all this information and you have to do something about it in the sense of providing a global response. So if the response has got to be global, you need to integrate all those informations, all those informational cues, and provide a global response that weights them relatively against each other, right? And that's where I think some form of sentience kicks in. So you need like a higher level focus of attention. So it's like you're not responding on a one-to-one channel, but you need to step back and integrate that all and provide that global response. That's what requires, in this really bad way of speaking, the guy at the wheel, if you see what I mean. So it's more difficult. The more I think about it, the more difficult I think it's to keep those two apart. If information processing is robust and sophisticated enough, it will have a story to tell about how integration is taking place. Of course, you don't want to fall into homuncular fallacies and things like that. So of course, it's not somebody at the wheel in that cartoon sense. But even if it's an emergent phenomena, we will have to deal with as if they are two sides of the same coin, I would say, right? It's true that behavior, being proactive, is adaptive as well. And at the end of the day, it boils down to being adaptive, right? So I would say so, yeah. The stress I was putting in between being reactive versus proactive is consistent with both being adaptive or maladaptive. This discussion, I think, is limited in the sense that has been polarized by these dichotomies, like phylogeny, ontogeny, for example. So we think in terms of mere adaptations, but why mere? Or why those adaptations, as she was saying, won't have to do with, why you couldn't see learning through those same glasses, right? So if we wouldn't put the emphasis on the phylogeny itself when we talk about adaptation, and we bring ontogeny on board as a continuum, then I'm happy to stick to that label as the background into which we put all these other finer grained discriminations like reactive and proactive and things like that, right? Well, climate change, I mean, that's because the question was how plants are going to behave, right?
Yeah.
So take salt stress or salt tolerance, right? Salt is bad news to life in general, right? And the lesson we learn from nature is that organisms, all sorts of organisms, keep coping with all these problems on a daily basis. So when we first thought life couldn't be somewhere, then you have all these guys that are doing well in places that we thought life couldn't exist. If you think of plant species which are halophytes, so those that tolerate salt, you have all sorts of strategies, different strategies to tolerate salt. So some of them allow the salt to pump out of the stomata and crystallize. And once it crystallizes, it becomes harmless. Others reduce the physiology, so not to dry up, metabolically speaking. So it's metabolical strategies, physiological strategies, physical strategies. So there's a whole set of toolkits to deal with sources of stress, which are changing constantly, because now the soil is more salted in some areas because of this rise of the sea level. So the fact that some of them are coping better than others, well, I would say is a fact of life, right? Mm-hmm. So if we cannot do anything about that other than learn from the way they are coping with those sources of stress. By learning in the specific strategies that they are developing, then that might give us some hints as to how we could ourselves learn from those strategies themselves, right? But of course, apart from trying to stop it, all you can do is watch and learn.
Tom, last word.
Really quick remark just on climate change. I mean, clearly in the context that's been highlighted to us, especially over the last month, thinking about plants in the context of climate change, we're thinking about the terrible deforestation that the Earth is still undergoing and how that feeds in hugely to climate change. And I think this puts us in quite a difficult position in that it leads us to start to think about forests and plants as resources in the fight against climate change, right? So I remember looking at David Attenborough's really important film a couple of weeks ago, and there's a moment in there where we're talking about bringing carbon back down from the atmosphere, right? And one of the participants says, well, we only have one tried and tested technology to do this at the moment, and that's trees, right? So it's a really arresting image that we have one technology to bring carbon back down, which is trees. We start to think of trees as carbon sinks, and that's the context in which we're thinking about them at the moment, which is really, really important, but does tend to move us away from what we've been trying to discuss in this panel, which is thinking, as you said right at the beginning, away from plants as particular resources for ourselves and carbon sinks as a kind of technology or a resource, and moving us away from thinking of them as living beings in their own right.
Sadly, we are way out of time. Thank you all for coming. Do join us next week when we'll be talking about Schopenhauer, and join me in thanking our speakers.